Have you ever wondered what it truly means to be free? To wake up one morning and realize that your land, your people, your destiny, no longer belong to someone else, but to you. Yet, what if that very freedom came wrapped in heartbreak, chaos, and the tearing apart of families and centuries of shared history? This is the untold story of how two nations, India and Pakistan, emerged from one of the most dramatic events of the 20th century. And tonight, here on World's Echoes, we are going to walk through those moments together. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe and join our community, where history's deepest echoes come alive. In the summer of 1947, as the British Empire loosened its grip on the world, South Asia stood on the edge of destiny. The air itself was heavy with hope, fear, and uncertainty. For nearly 2 centuries, the British Crown had controlled the vast lands of India, lands that were home to more than 400 million people, a dizzying tapestry of languages, cultures, and religions. But by 1947, the empire was crumbling. Exhausted by the Second World War, drained of resources, and increasingly challenged by independence movements across the globe, Britain knew its time in India was over. What they did not fully know, or perhaps chose to ignore, was the chaos that their departure would unleash. To understand why 1947 became such a turning point, we need to go back decades earlier. The seeds of freedom were sown not in one grand moment, but in countless small acts of resistance. Ordinary men and women, farmers and poets, soldiers and scholars each played a part. Some chose the path of nonviolence, following leaders who preached unity and peace. Others chose confrontation, believing only direct struggle could shake off the chains of empire. And in these choices, we begin to see the story of two nations forming, like rivers branching off from the same stream. Imagine standing in the bustling streets of Delhi in the 1920s. The smell of spices fills the air, horse-drawn carriages rattle past, and shopkeepers call out in a dozen tongues. But beneath the rhythm of daily life, a tension hums. Posters call for Swaraj, self-rule. British soldiers march in formation, watching carefully. And in quiet corners of the city, men and women whisper about change. This was not just politics, it was the stirring of a dream, the dream of a free India. Yet, freedom meant different things to different people. For some, it meant a secular land where Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and Christians could live together. For others, it meant a nation where one identity would finally rise above the shadow of another. As decades passed, these differences began to sharpen. Leaders emerged with powerful voices, some urging unity, others arguing for division. The British, ever skilled at ruling by divide and conquer, watched as the lines deepened. And all the while, the people of India grew restless. By the 1930s and 1940s, the cry for independence was no longer a distant echo. It was a roar. But freedom was not going to be handed over like a gift. It was going to be wrestled from the empire's grip, piece by piece, protest by protest, life by life. And when the British finally decided to leave, the question was not just when, it was how. How do you untangle centuries of rule over such a vast, diverse land? How do you draw borders on maps that cut through villages, rivers, and homes? And most haunting of all, how do you divide people who, for centuries, had lived as neighbors? It was in these questions that the tragedy of partition was born. For while 1947 gave India and Pakistan their independence, it also unleashed one of the largest migrations in human history. Millions were uprooted. Families fled in panic. Trains arrived at stations not filled with passengers, but with silence and loss. Freedom had come, but at a cost few could have imagined. As we unravel this story, we will walk through the streets where protests shook the empire, step inside the rooms where leaders argued over the future, and witness the human struggles of ordinary people caught in the storm. Some stories will inspire you. Others may break your heart. But together, they form the untold story of India and Pakistan's fight for freedom. And before we move deeper into this journey, I want to ask you something. If you had been alive in 1947, standing at the crossroads of history, would you have chosen unity or division? Let me know in the comments. The story of India and Pakistan's freedom is not just a political drama, it's a human saga. At its heart are the people, millions of ordinary men and women, who carried the burden of hope and fear as the empire's foundations trembled. To truly understand what happened in 1947, we have to rewind to the days when British power first began to sink its roots deep into the soil of South Asia. By the mid-1800s, the British had gone from traders to rulers. What began with the East India Company, trading spices and textiles, soon turned into conquest. Soldiers marched under foreign flags. Taxes drained villages dry. And with every passing decade, the empire's grip tightened. But in the shadows of this dominance, resistance flickered. The rebellion of 1857 was one of the first great shocks to British rule, an uprising that saw soldiers, peasants, and princes rise against the company. It was crushed, but it planted a seed. The seed of defiance. From then on, every generation added new fuel to the fire. By the early 20th century, the Indian National Congress had become a loud voice for independence. At first, it was cautious, asking politely for reforms, pleading for self-rule. But with every broken promise, with every massacre and insult, patience wore thin. And then, out of this growing storm, certain figures rose to prominence. Among them was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. A lawyer who had seen the sharp edge of discrimination in South Africa, Gandhi returned to India with an idea that would change the face of resistance: nonviolence. The idea that you could challenge an empire not with guns, but with truth and peaceful defiance. Imagine the sight of thousands of men and women, refusing to pay taxes, spinning their own cloth, marching to the sea to make salt in defiance of unjust laws. It was not just protest, it was theater, it was strategy, it was a moral challenge to the world's greatest empire. But Gandhi was not alone in shaping the destiny of the subcontinent. There was also Jawaharlal Nehru, a charismatic leader who dreamed of a modern, secular India. His speeches were filled with passion, his presence magnetic. And standing across from him, often in the same rooms yet holding a different vision, was Muhammad Ali Jinnah. A man of sharp suits, sharper words, and an unwavering belief that Muslims of India needed their own homeland, a place where their identity would not be swallowed by the majority. These men, Gandhi, Nehru, and Jinnah, were not just politicians, they were symbols, guiding millions toward a future none of them could fully see. As the 1930s and 40s unfolded, tensions only deepened. The world outside was at war, and India itself was drawn into it. British leaders promised freedom after the war, but trust was already shattered. The Quit India movement in 1942 was not a polite request, it was a roar demanding the empire leave. British prisons filled with protesters, but the tide was unstoppable. And yet, as freedom drew closer, unity seemed to drift farther away. Imagine the drawing rooms of Delhi and London where maps were being discussed. Lines drawn with ink that would later cut through villages, rivers, and families. The idea of partition, once unthinkable, was becoming real. Jinnah's call for Pakistan grew louder, insisting that Muslims could not be safe in a united India. The Congress leaders resisted, hoping for unity, but the weight of history was pressing down. By 1946, riots had erupted. Calcutta burned in the violence of Direct Action Day, where neighbor turned on neighbor, and the dream of peaceful coexistence seemed to crack. The British, weary from war and drained of power, decided they could wait no longer. They would leave India, and they would leave quickly. The decision was breathtaking in its speed. Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy, was given the impossible task: end nearly 200 years of colonial rule, divide a land of 400 million people, and do it all in just a few months. The countdown to independence had begun. Picture the scene in the summer of 1947. In the corridors of power, maps were unfurled, pens hovered over borders, and men in suits debated the future of millions. In the streets, whispers spread like wildfire. Would their village fall in India or in Pakistan? Would their home suddenly belong to another country? Families prayed, argued, and packed their belongings in fear. Hope and dread coexisted in every heart. And yet, even amidst this uncertainty, there was a current of joy. After centuries of foreign rule, the dream of freedom was finally real. People painted slogans on walls, waved flags, and prepared for celebrations. The British Union Jack was about to come down. The tricolor of India and the crescent and star of Pakistan were about to rise. Two nations, born at midnight. But the midnight hour did not only bring joy. It also brought blood. Trains filled with refugees crossed borders, some never arrived. Villages emptied as millions fled in both directions, Hindus and Sikhs heading to India, Muslims to Pakistan. Along the way, violence erupted with a fury that scarred generations. It was one of the largest migrations in human history, and one of the most tragic. This is where the story of independence becomes more than dates and speeches. It becomes human. A mother clutching her child as she boards a train, not knowing if she'll ever see her home again. A father digging through ashes where his shop once stood. Friends, once inseparable, now divided by borders they never asked for. The cost of freedom was paid not only in political negotiations, but in tears, in blood, in silence. And yet, despite the chaos, the dream lived on. At midnight, on August 14th and 15th, 1947, as the world watched, Pakistan and India were born. Muhammad Ali Jinnah addressed his new nation, urging them to work together for unity, discipline, and faith. In India, Jawaharlal Nehru spoke of a tryst with destiny, of a moment when the soul of a nation, long suppressed, found utterance. These speeches still echo today, carrying the weight of history. But what did independence really mean? For some, it was triumph. For others, tragedy. And for the millions caught between, it was survival. The story of 1947 is not just about borders and nations, it's about people. About the resilience of those who rebuilt their lives from nothing, about the courage of those who held on to hope, about the pain of loss, and the pride of freedom. Even today, the echoes of that moment ripple across the subcontinent and beyond. Borders may have been drawn, but the memories, the songs, the stories, they still belong to a shared history. The midnight of August 1947 was celebrated with fireworks, speeches, and cheers that rang out across cities and villages. Yet, as the world celebrated the birth of two free nations, the land itself was trembling. Independence had come, yes, but it had come with a wound so deep that it bled across borders, homes, and hearts. Imagine a train pulling out of Lahore station. Its windows are crammed with families, children clutching their mothers, fathers gripping whatever little they could carry, elders wrapped in silence. They are heading east, toward what is now India, leaving behind homes they had known for generations. On the other side, another train departs Amritsar, packed with families heading west toward the newborn Pakistan. Both trains are filled with hope, fear, and desperation. Yet, not all of them would reach their destinations. Many trains that crossed the new borders became silent graveyards, massacred along the way by mobs blinded by hatred and vengeance. This was the reality of partition, one of the largest and most violent migrations in human history. Nearly 15 million people were uprooted in just a few months. Hindus and Sikhs fled west to India, while Muslims poured east into Pakistan. Entire villages were emptied overnight. Families carried little more than the clothes on their backs. The land was alive with movement, streams of people walking along dusty roads, carts creaking under the weight of belongings, rivers of humanity flowing in both directions. But along with this exodus came violence, horrific, unimaginable violence. Neighbors who once shared meals turned against each other. Mobs roamed, fueled by anger and fear. Houses were burned. Innocent people were killed simply for being on the wrong side of religion or border. The trauma of these days is still carried in whispered stories across generations. A grandmother who fled Lahore still remembers the burning streets. A grandfather from Amritsar still recalls the silence of trains that never arrived. These are not just history, they are living memories. And yet, amidst this ocean of suffering, there were sparks of humanity. Ordinary people who risked their lives to protect neighbors of another faith. Villagers who had families in barns, who guided them across dangerous roads, who chose compassion over hatred. These stories remind us that even in the darkest chapters of history, light still flickers. As the dust of migration settled, both India and Pakistan faced the monumental task of building nations from the rubble. Pakistan was born almost overnight, with no capital ready, no administrative framework, and a flood of refugees pouring in. Government offices were set up in makeshift tents. Paperwork was done on borrowed desks. Leaders worked with urgency, trying to turn a dream into reality before it slipped away. For Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the burden was immense. As the Quaid-e-Azam, or great leader, he was not just the founder but the father of a fragile new state. His health was failing, but his determination burned bright. He urged his people to build with unity, to rise above divisions, to forge a future for their new homeland. Across the border, India too was struggling with the aftermath. Millions of refugees poured into Delhi, Amritsar, Calcutta, and other cities. Camps were set up, food and shelter scrambled together. Violence simmered, and leaders like Gandhi walked barefoot into the heart of riots, pleading for peace. Gandhi's presence was like a candle in the storm, fragile, flickering, but resolute. He fasted, he prayed, he begged his people to stop the madness. Yet even he could not hold back the tide forever. In the months that followed, the governments of both nations tried to bring order to chaos. Refugee commissions were formed, borders were patrolled, and armies divided their ranks. The British, now gone, watched from afar as their former colony struggled to breathe on its own. The wound of partition was raw, but the work of nation-building had begun. For India, independence was a chance to realize a vision Nehru had long spoken of: a secular, democratic republic, modern and progressive. Plans were made for industries, schools, and institutions. The Indian Constitution was drafted, promising equality and justice for all. In speeches, Nehru spoke of building dams and factories, of science and progress, of lifting a nation of millions into a new era. For Pakistan, the path was different but equally ambitious. The idea of Pakistan was rooted in the promise of a homeland for Muslims, a place where they could live with dignity and security. Karachi became the first capital, and Jinnah worked tirelessly, even as his health declined. He spoke of discipline, unity, and faith, principles he believed could hold his new nation together. But Pakistan faced daunting challenges. Refugee crises, financial strain, and a lack of institutions made every step a struggle. And yet, the spirit of survival was fierce. Amid all this, one figure loomed larger than life: Gandhi. The man who had spent decades preaching nonviolence now found himself in a country drowning in bloodshed. He refused to give up. In Delhi, when riots broke out, Gandhi fasted until the violence ceased. His frail body became a symbol of moral resistance. Crowds wept as they saw him weaken, his silence suffering a plea for humanity. But tragically, his life was cut short just months after independence. In January 1948, Gandhi was assassinated by a Hindu extremist who believed he had betrayed his own people. The father of India, who had devoted his life to peace, died violently. His death shocked the world and left a wound in the heart of the nation. Meanwhile, Jinnah too was fading. His health had been failing even during the days of independence, and by September 1948, just a year after Pakistan's birth, he passed away. For Pakistan, it was an unimaginable loss, the founding father gone so soon, leaving his young nation to find its way without him. The deaths of Gandhi and Jinnah, so close together, felt almost symbolic. The two men had carried opposing visions, yet both had been central to the story of freedom. With them gone, the future lay in the hands of new leaders, and the people themselves. The late 1940s were years of rebuilding and reckoning. India and Pakistan, though born in the same moment, began to carve very different paths. India leaned toward democracy and secularism, while Pakistan sought to define itself through its Islamic identity. Yet both carried the scars of partition, scars that shaped their politics, their societies, and their relations with one another. The shadow of 1947 never truly left. For those who lived it, the memories were too sharp. And for their children and grandchildren, the stories were passed down like heirlooms, reminders of sacrifice, loss, and the price of freedom. And as we look back now, more than 7 decades later, one question remains: could it have been different? Could independence have come without partition? Could neighbors have remained neighbors, without borders, without bloodshed? History does not offer easy answers. But what it does give us are lessons about unity, about division, about the choices of leaders and the power of ordinary people. The birth of India and Pakistan was not the end of the story. In many ways, it was only the beginning. Freedom had been won, but now came the challenge of survival, of shaping identities, of proving to the world that these two newborn nations could stand on their own. The independence of 1947 had opened the door, but what lay beyond it was uncertain, turbulent, and filled with trials. In India, the first years were consumed by the colossal task of building a democracy from scratch. Jawaharlal Nehru, now the country's first prime minister, stood at the helm. He spoke with the passion of a dreamer and the confidence of a builder, telling his people that India must rise, not as a divided land of castes and religions, but as one nation, united by democracy, science, and progress. The Indian constitution was carefully drafted, debated over countless sessions, and in 1950, India officially became a republic. For a nation so vast, so diverse, this was nothing short of remarkable. But the challenges were immense. Poverty was widespread. Illiteracy gripped millions. Industries had to be built, roads laid, schools opened. Refugees still needed homes. And yet, the spirit of a new India was alive. Trains that once carried refugees now carried workers and students. Factories began to hum. Farmers tilled their fields with hope that the harvest of independence would feed their children. Across the border, Pakistan was wrestling with its own survival. Unlike India, which had inherited most of the subcontinent's infrastructure, Pakistan had been carved suddenly and awkwardly. Its capital, Karachi, was a port city pressed into service as the seat of power. Its administration was hurriedly stitched together. Millions of refugees had flooded in, desperate for homes, jobs, and food. Jinnah, frail but determined, worked day and night to give direction to his young country. He envisioned Pakistan as a homeland for Muslims, yes, but also as a state where minorities would have rights, where discipline and faith would guide progress. Yet his death in 1948 left a vacuum too soon. The early years were filled with uncertainty. Pakistan's leadership shifted, governments fell, and the army grew increasingly influential. The struggle was not just political, it was existential. How do you build a nation out of fragments? How do you create unity when geography itself divides you, with West Pakistan and East Pakistan separated by 1,000 miles of Indian territory? These questions hung heavy over the new country. And then, almost immediately, came war. In 1947 itself, even as independence celebrations still echoed, conflict broke out over Kashmir. The princely state, perched in the Himalayas, was caught in the middle. Its ruler, a Hindu, hesitated over whether to join India or Pakistan, while its population, mostly Muslim, leaned toward Pakistan. The indecision led to fighting. Tribesmen from Pakistan invaded, India sent troops, and suddenly the two nations, only months old, were at war. By the time a ceasefire was brokered in 1949, Kashmir was divided, India held part, Pakistan the other. And the seeds of a conflict that continues even today were sown in those first years of freedom. For the people on both sides, this was bewildering. They had just survived partition, just begun to rebuild their lives, and now they were thrust into yet another struggle. Soldiers fought in icy mountains. Villages near the borders trembled at the sound of gunfire. Kashmir, beautiful and serene, became a symbol of unfinished business, of promises unfulfilled. Through the 1950s and 60s, both nations tried to balance survival with ambition. India embarked on building massive dams, factories, and institutions of learning. Leaders like Nehru believed in the power of science and education to transform society. Cities buzzed with new industries, while the countryside slowly began to modernize. Yet poverty remained, and political disagreements simmered beneath the surface. Pakistan, meanwhile, grappled with instability. Governments came and went, and by the late 1950s, the military had stepped into power. General Ayub Khan took control, promising stability and modernization. Under his rule, Pakistan experienced periods of economic growth, with industries sprouting and cities like Karachi booming with trade. But political freedoms were curtailed, and unrest continued to stir beneath the surface. The two countries, though born together, were moving down very different paths. Yet their destinies remained tied. In 1965, war returned. Once again, the conflict centered on Kashmir. Tanks rolled across the plains of Punjab, fighter jets screamed through the skies, and civilians took shelter as bombs fell. The war ended without clear victory, but it deepened the mistrust, the rivalry, the bitterness that had begun in 1947. For the ordinary people, life carried on in the shadow of these tensions. Children grew up hearing stories of war and partition. Families in border regions lived with uncertainty. Yet markets bustled, weddings were celebrated, songs were sung. Life was not only about conflict, it was also about resilience, about carrying on despite the storms. By the 1970s, both nations faced new turning points. In India, Nehru had passed away, and his daughter, Indira Gandhi, had risen to power. Strong-willed and controversial, she steered India through wars, economic crises, and political upheavals. In Pakistan, tensions between East and West grew unbearable. East Pakistan, with its Bengali-speaking majority, felt neglected and exploited by the political and military elite of the West. Protests grew into resistance, resistance turned into revolt, and in 1971, civil war erupted. India intervened, and by the end of that year, Pakistan was split in two. East Pakistan had become Bangladesh, a new nation born from the struggle of identity and neglect. For Pakistan, it was a shattering loss. For India, it was a moment of triumph. For the world, it was a reminder that the scars of 1947 had not healed, they had only deepened and multiplied. And yet, through all of this, the echoes of independence still resonated. Every speech, every decision, every conflict was shaped by that midnight in 1947. Both nations continued to define themselves, to ask who they were and who they wanted to be. It's worth pausing here to remind you, if you've been with us on this long journey through history, to take a moment and support this channel. A story like this, filled with pain and courage, deserves to be remembered and shared. So if you're finding this as moving as we are in telling it, please like this video, share it with others who love history, and subscribe to World's Echoes. Together, we can keep bringing the forgotten echoes of our past to life. Now, back to the story. As the decades passed, India and Pakistan were pulled into the larger drama of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union both sought influence in South Asia. Pakistan aligned itself more closely with America, receiving military aid and support. India, under leaders like Nehru and later Indira Gandhi, leaned toward the Soviet Union, embracing a policy of non-alignment but often tilting in Moscow's favor. The subcontinent was no longer just a local battleground, it had become a stage where global superpowers played their games. For the people on the ground, though, these high-level politics often felt distant. What mattered more was food on the table, schools for their children, and peace in their neighborhoods. And yet, the tug-of-war of superpowers did shape their lives. Aid projects, military buildup, and political alliances influenced economies and futures. By the late 20th century, both India and Pakistan had transformed in ways no one in 1947 could have fully imagined. But the shadow of their shared birth, the trauma of partition, and the rivalry born of those early days never truly faded. The decades after the 1971 war left both India and Pakistan at a crossroads. Each had endured trauma, but each also carried new ambitions. The subcontinent was no longer a place of only survival, it was entering an age of power politics, economic change, and nuclear shadows. For India, the 1970s and 80s brought moments of both pride and pain. Indira Gandhi, the powerful prime minister, declared a state of emergency in 1975, suspending democratic freedoms in the name of stability. It was a controversial move that scarred India's democratic traditions, but when elections returned, the people's voice once again proved stronger than any leader. India's democracy, despite its flaws, endured. Economically, India struggled through much of the late 20th century. Poverty was deep, corruption was rife, and industries lagged behind the West and even its own Asian neighbors. But the seeds of change were being planted. By the 1990s, India began opening its economy, inviting global companies, and unleashing a wave of growth that would one day transform it into a global powerhouse. Pakistan, too, was reshaping itself. After the humiliation of losing East Pakistan, the nation turned inward, trying to recover its pride. Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto promised a new Pakistan, championing socialism, industry, and nuclear ambition. He famously declared that Pakistanis would eat grass if necessary, but the country would build its own nuclear bomb to defend itself. And so began South Asia's dangerous dance with nuclear weapons. Both India and Pakistan pursued atomic technology, each suspicious of the other, each determined not to be left behind. India tested its first nuclear device in 1974, calling it a peaceful explosion. Pakistan, lacking resources, relied on scientists like Abdul Qadir Khan to build its own program in secret. By the 1980s and 90s, the region stood on the edge of a nuclear standoff. But the rivalry was not only nuclear. It was also fought on battlefields and in politics. In 1999, the Kargil War erupted high in the mountains of Kashmir. Pakistani soldiers and fighters crossed into Indian territory, sparking fierce battles in the icy peaks. India pushed them back, but the war showed just how fragile peace was and how close the two nuclear-armed nations could come to disaster. Amid this, both countries also faced internal struggles. In India, communal tensions flared, sometimes erupting into riots that scarred cities and villages. In Pakistan, military rule returned again and again, with generals like Zia-ul-Haq reshaping the nation in the name of Islamization. The promise of democracy flickered, but never fully went out. Yet beyond the politics, beyond the wars, there were also threads of connection that never truly snapped. Cricket matches between India and Pakistan were more than sport, they were electric spectacles, where entire nations held their breath. Bollywood films slipped across borders, watched secretly in homes or openly in cinemas. Songs, stories, and poetry flowed between the two lands, carried by shared culture and history. Ordinary people often longed for peace. Families separated by partition still tried to reconnect. Writers and artists from both sides spoke of unity, of remembering that before 1947, they were one people. Pilgrims crossed borders to visit sacred shrines, Sikhs to Nankana Sahib in Pakistan, Muslims to Ajmer Sharif in India. These were reminders that culture, faith, and humanity could not be cut in half by a line on a map. But the shadow of partition refused to fade. In times of crisis, old wounds reopened. Political leaders sometimes used the memory of division as a weapon, fueling nationalism by pointing to the enemy across the border. And so, the cycle of suspicion continued. Then came the 21st century. The world was changing: globalization, technology, terrorism, climate change, and India and Pakistan found themselves in its currents. In 1998, both nations had tested nuclear weapons openly, declaring to the world that they were atomic powers. The world watched with alarm, fearing that South Asia could become the site of a nuclear confrontation. After September 11, Pakistan was pulled into the war on terror, becoming an ally of the United States but also a victim of violent extremism within its own borders. Bombings, instability, and political assassinations shook the country. Yet through it all, resilience shone through. Markets reopened after attacks, schools rebuilt, and ordinary citizens kept pushing forward. India, meanwhile, was rising as an economic giant. Its tech industry boomed, its middle class grew, and its global influence expanded. Cities like Bangalore, Delhi, and Mumbai became hubs of opportunity. But India too faced challenges: communal violence, corruption scandals, and the constant pressure of balancing growth with justice for its millions still in poverty. The relationship between India and Pakistan remained tense. Talks of peace would rise, cricket diplomacy would bring moments of hope, but then new attacks or political disputes would push them back into hostility. The story seemed caught in an endless loop. And yet, through all of this, one truth remained: both nations were born from the same midnight in 1947. Their destinies were forever linked, whether through conflict, culture, or the shared memories of a past that could never be forgotten. Today, when people look back at that night of independence, they see more than flags raised and speeches given. They see the human cost: the trains of refugees, the weeping mothers, the children lost, the cities divided. But they also see courage, the leaders who dared to dream, the families who rebuilt from nothing, the artists and thinkers who kept reminding both nations of their shared humanity. The untold story of independence is not only about how India and Pakistan won their freedom, but about how they struggled, stumbled, and survived after it. It is about how two nations, born together, continue to mirror each other, for better or worse. Midnight of August 14 and 15, 1947, is often remembered with flags waving, fireworks sparkling, and crowds cheering in the streets. But when we look closer, we see something far more complex. Freedom was not simply a celebration, it was also a wound. Independence gave birth to joy and sorrow in the same breath. Two nations were born, yes, but so too was a legacy of division, of longing, of what could have been. 70-plus years later, the echoes of 1947 still shape the lives of over 1 billion people. India and Pakistan walk their own paths, yet their stories remain intertwined. One rose as the world's largest democracy, striving to balance diversity and unity, struggling with inequality but marching toward global power. The other emerged as a nation carved from faith and identity, enduring military rule and challenges but never losing its resilience, its spirit of survival, and its pursuit of dignity on the world stage. And yet, if you look past the politics and the headlines, you see something extraordinary. You see farmers on both sides growing the same crops, smelling the same earth after the rain. You hear poets who speak in Urdu and Hindi, languages born of the same soil. You watch children playing cricket in Karachi or Kolkata, their laughter carrying the same melody. You see faces that look alike, families whose grandparents once lived side by side. The borders may divide maps, but they cannot erase memory. This is the untold story of independence. Not just the negotiations in London, or the speeches of Nehru, Jinnah, and Mountbatten, but the human story, the grandmother who carried her child across a burning field, the young man who rebuilt his life after losing everything, the millions who dared to dream of freedom, even when freedom came with pain. Today, as the world looks at India and Pakistan, the lesson of 1947 is more important than ever. Independence is not only about flags and power, it is about responsibility. It is about remembering the price that was paid so that future generations could live in dignity. And perhaps, it is also about healing, about looking at the scars of the past not as reasons for hatred, but as reminders of what happens when division triumphs over unity. History does not end with dates and documents. It lives on in us, in the way nations treat each other, in the way neighbors speak to one another, in the way we choose peace or conflict. And so, the story of India and Pakistan's fight for freedom is not finished. It continues with every generation that asks, can we learn from the past, or are we doomed to repeat it? At World's Echoes, we believe that history is not just a record, it is a mirror. And tonight, as you've walked with me through the journey of 1947, I hope you felt the weight of its lessons. I hope you saw not just the flags rising, but the tears falling. Not just the maps being drawn, but the hearts being broken. And I hope, above all, you carry with you a question. What does freedom really mean? Is it only about independence from rulers, or is it about building a world where humanity itself is free from division, hate, and fear? If this journey moved you, if you learned something new, then I invite you be part of our community. Like this video, share it with someone who cares about history, and subscribe to World's Echoes. Because together, we will keep uncovering the hidden stories, the untold moments, and the echoes of the past that still shape our future. Thank you for walking with me through this story of independence, of struggle, of hope. Until next time, remember, history is never silent. If you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes.